Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series, where today we're going to be talking about planning a full moon photo. And not just a photo of the full moon, but a photo that incorporates the full moon. So generally speaking, a photo that has something in the foreground, but placing the moon in the sky, essentially alongside a particular scene that you might want to photograph. So we'll talk about a variety of different aspects of that planning. Thank you, though, first and foremost, for joining me today. My name is Tim Gray. Of course, I know many of you are already familiar. You get my Ask Tim Gray email newsletter every day. Many of you watch my video training courses, my GreyLearning video training courses, or subscribe to the ultimate bundle of those courses. We've been leading online photo workshops over the past, well, it's been nearly a year now that we've been doing monthly online workshops for photographers and so much more. I've been keeping busy, needless to say. But I'm really excited about today's presentation in part, and part of what made me decide that I wanted to talk about this topic is that we recently produced a video course for the GreyLearning library that focuses on PhotoPills, which is an app that I'm going to demonstrate as part of today's presentation that enables you to plan a wide variety of aspects of photography. So I'll have more on that later on in the presentation. Before we do get started, I want to give a thanks to Tamron. They make this webinar series possible. They sponsor the GreyLearning webinar series. And so if you haven't already, be sure to check out their YouTube channel at youtube.com/TamronVids. There's a variety of great videos there, entertaining and informative all at the same time. And speaking of Tamron, stay tuned to the end of today's presentation because I'll share information about a photo contest where you could win a Tamron 100 to 400 millimeter lens. That would be for a Canon or Nikon mount, but I'll have details on that at the end. And along the way today, by the way, if you've got questions or comments, feel free to share those. I'll try to get to as many of those as I can. If I'm not able to get to all of them, then I'll try to incorporate them into upcoming editions of the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. But if you do have questions, over on the right side of your screen, you should see that little question mark icon that indicates the option to ask questions. If you click that icon, then that will open up a panel where you're able to, down at the bottom of the panel, type in a question and click send there. And again, I'll get to as many of those as I possibly can. Both questions and comments are certainly welcome. Jeff, you're very welcome. Thank you very much. But without further ado, let's talk about planning a full moon photo. And once again, at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about a course that I have, a video course that covers more details about PhotoPills. I'll show you just a little bit of the details of what's possible in PhotoPills in the specific context of a full moon photo. We'll talk about some other apps, some other techniques, some other considerations as well. But the first thing, of course, is to figure out when is the full moon. And so I imagine many of you are familiar on some level with the details of how the moon works, at least in basic concepts. So the moon takes about 27 days to revolve around the Earth. So about every 27 days, there is a full moon. The question is, how do you find out when the moon will be full, other than just by looking up at the sky? Obviously, many of us are familiar with the new moon, where the moon is essentially dark, or a crescent moon. And then, of course, the full moon, perhaps one of our favorite moons, and especially for incorporating into a photo. And so there's naturally a variety of ways. You may have noticed, as I have, that increasingly now I'm seeing news articles talking about the upcoming full moon or the supermoon. So how do we actually figure out, essentially, when there's going to be a full moon, and not just when is the next full moon, but when is essentially any full moon? If you're going to be traveling to a particular location that you think might be a good candidate for a photo that incorporates the moon, then you could certainly make that part of your overall planning. You can plan well in advance. So let's take a look. I'm going to switch here, looking at my smartphone, and this is the PhotoPills app, which is a key component in our presentation today. And there are a couple other apps that are very similar to this, but this is the one that I've been using lately for a variety of purposes, for planning photos, calculating exposure, and all sorts of other great details of planning your photos. And PhotoPills includes the app, which is available for iOS or Android, by the way. And so both iOS iPhone users, essentially, and Android smartphone users are able to make use of PhotoPills. And it consists of a variety of pills. And think like pills like medicine to help you solve a problem, essentially. And so there are a variety of pills for different categories of photography, essentially, various aspects of photography. And first and foremost, we're going to be taking a look at the moon pill. So I'm going to scroll here just a little bit, and you can see there's a wide variety of different topics. There's a timer and time-lapse calculator, how to figure out to achieve spot stars as opposed to star trails, for example. All sorts of great information that you can glean from within PhotoPills. But we're going to take a look first and foremost at the moon pill. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see moon. I can tap that to go into the moon pill. And this enables me to get the details of the moon, of course. And so we can see here that we actually have a waning gibbous moon on this date for my location. And waning means that it is gradually diminishing. In other words, it's heading toward a new moon or heading away from a full moon. And so we can see the details, the current phase of the moon, and below that, you'll see that we have an indication of the time that the moon will set. See the arrow indicating downward on the left-hand side. So the moon will set, or did set in this case, at 8:43 a.m., and it will rise again at 6:28 p.m. And I can also scroll down and see additional details. So for example, the sunrise was at 6:41 a.m. and the moon set a little bit later, so I would see a nearly full moon for a couple of hours after sunrise as it makes its way toward the horizon. And so these details are helpful, but I'm not looking for today's moon necessarily. I want to take a look at details of a future full moon, for example. And again, this could be based on any number of possibilities as far as where you're going to be and on what date. So let's start by taking a look at the calendar. So down at the bottom left of the PhotoPills app here within the moon pill, I can tap calendar, and that takes me to, naturally, a calendar looking at the current month at the moment and the current date. So today happens to be December 2nd, 2020. And so we see the blue circle indicating that that is the present date. We can also see additional details. So the calendar shows us the phases of the moon. So we know when the new moon is going to be on December 20th. And again, this is based on my location. So we might need to look for other locations, as we'll see a little bit later. And we see an indication. So see the circle that is not filled in next to 14, December 14th. That's the new moon date. And we can also see the half moon. We have the full moon, though. So we know now that the next full moon, the final full moon of the year 2020, will be on December the 29th. And so I could actually tap on that date in order to go to the Information tab. So switching back to Info, which, by the way, is one of the options down at the bottom left, so to the left of Calendar. But within the calendar, I can tap on a date on the calendar and be taken to that date for, in this case, the moon, so December 29th, when the moon will be full, and precisely at 9:29 p.m. And so we can once again see the various details about the moon on a particular date. So here, paying attention to the next full moon. And by the way, the full moon is at a precise moment in time when the moon is most full. So the moon is gradually moving to that position where it's precisely opposite the sun when it is absolutely at its fullest, and then it starts to wane once again. But of course, we don't have to photograph the full moon at precisely that time. There's a little wiggle room where we still have a moon that appears full a bit before and a bit after. Now, in this case, for example, maybe I would like to plan for a full moon photo in a different location. Let's assume, for example, that I was going to be traveling to Italy. The photo, I'll show you a photo a little bit later that was captured in Rome, Italy, and so we could use that as an example. And so up at the top right of the moon pill here, we have a Settings tab. So I can tap Settings, And then there's position and date. For the moment, I'm going to start off with just position, but I could set a particular date here if I wanted to as well. And so I'll tap position, and here I could dial in latitude and longitude coordinates if I had them. I don't know. I could certainly figure that out with Google Maps or some other tool, but I'm just going to tap in the search address field up at the top, and then I'll just type Rome, Italy, and search, and there we go, Rome, Italy. And so I can tap that in the search result, and then up at the top right, tap Done. And so now you'll notice there's a little bit of a change here. I've changed my location to Italy, but I did not change the date. Well, you'll notice now that the moon shows at the top center there that on this date, December 29th, the moon will not be full. It will actually be a waxing gibbous. In other words, it's getting closer to full, but it's not yet full. That's because of the time difference. So the full moon occurs in the central time zone in this case on December 29th, and that was at approximately 9:30 p.m. Well, that's going to be early in the morning the following day, Italy time. And so I would want to take a look at a different date, essentially, when it comes to the full moon for Italy. So just bearing in mind the time zone consideration. In fact, if I go back to the calendar, you'll see that the full moon appears for the 30th rather than the 29th. So again, that's just because of the time zone difference. So I'll tap the 30th, and we see an indication now. So up at the top, the details about the full moon, and it will set at 7:58 a.m. It will be fully full, maximum fullness at 4:29 a.m., a bit early, but it will rise at just shy of 8 a.m. and then it will set at just shy of 8 a.m. and rise at just after 5 p.m. So note the arrow indicating downward for setting and upward for rising for that moon. And so now we can get a little bit more of the details, of course, and knowing the time that the moon will rise, what time will sunset be. So sunrise, for example, if we scroll down just a little bit here, we'll see that the sunrise is at 7:38 a.m. and the moon will set 20 minutes later. So we won't have too much time to photograph that moon setting because we only got 20 minutes after the sunrise before the moon sets. And of course, we could photograph a little bit before sunrise as well. So a little bit more of a window there. And then the sunset is at 4:48 p.m. on this particular date, and the moon will rise at 5:03. And so that should give us a pretty good opportunity as well. Obviously, being, what would that be, about 15 minutes after sunset, it's not going to be fully dark yet. We'll still have some light in the sky, probably some color in the sky, etc. So again, getting some of those details. I do want to switch back, though, to the calendar option here in Moon and show you another option, and that is to look for supermoons. Renee, you're checking all the people? And so a supermoon is a moon that is full, but is also close to the Earth. So first off, let's take a look at a supermoon. So we've seen the various phases of the moon here. I can scroll down a little bit further, and there's January's moon phases, where the full moon will be on January 28th. Once again, Italy time. We're currently set to Rome, Italy as our location. And scrolling down a bit further, we can see that in Italy, European time, April 27th. In North America, that would be April 26th, 2021. There will be a full moon. But notice we have a yellow circle around that particular moon. That's because this is a supermoon. And so you may be familiar that the moon, as do the other planets and the other celestial objects, they go around the sun, for example, or the moon goes around the Earth in an elliptical path. It's not circular, but elliptical. So if you think of that ellipse as a path going, in the case of the moon, going around the Earth, there's the portion of that ellipse that is closest to the Earth, and there is the points on that ellipse that are furthest from the Earth. And so those are the perigee and the apogee. So the closest would be the perigee, and the farthest away would be the apogee. And so one of the definitions, there's not really, I would say, a strict definition of a supermoon. It's just a full moon that's close to the Earth, essentially. But it's generally regarded as a full moon that is no more than 10% further away from Earth than the closest approach, that perigee. Of course, this varies a little bit. For example, this calendar year, as it happens, not that we really need to worry about these numbers, but the closest perigee for 2020 is just over 211, or just shy of 212,000 miles. And the furthest apogee is just shy of 253,000 miles. And so a supermoon would be in the approximate range of 212,000 to 225,000 miles. If it gets that close at its perigee, then, or during the full moon, then we call that a supermoon. So it really just means a full moon that is especially close, which is helpful for photographers because it means the moon is going to appear a little bit larger in the sky, and it also means that it'll appear a little bit larger relative to the scene in which we photograph that full moon. The reason I talk about those distances is because there's also a distances option here. If we take a look down toward the bottom right of PhotoPills, the app that we're using here, distances, I'll go ahead and tap distances, and we see first a section here of supermoons, full moons that are close to perigee, or the closest point on that elliptical orbit. And so in this case, we're looking at calendar year 2020. Let's switch up at the top right here. I'm going to tap on 2021 so we can see some of the supermoons for next year. So again, keep in mind that these dates right now are based on Italy. I've set my location to Rome, Italy. And so for North America, it'd be one day earlier based on the time difference. But in this case, on April the 27th, 2021, we've got a supermoon. You even get to know the distance here, 222,206 miles, in case you were wondering. And then once again on May 26th, 2021, we'll have another supermoon. And so those would be great dates to photograph the full moon as well. And then we also have a section here for perigees. In other words, minimum distance, but not necessarily a minimum distance that is especially close, meaning, obviously the moon's still relatively far away, but along that ellipse with the orbit varying from time, each orbit essentially, there's a little bit of variation there. So minimum distance to the Earth is not necessarily supermoon distance. It might be a little bit on the outer range of a typical perigee. So these aren't necessarily the very closest, but they're close, relatively speaking. And over to the right, these are not supermoons, so they're not by definition full moons. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see an icon that indicates both the phase of the moon. So we see a crescent, a half moon, and mostly full moon. We've got a full moon there. You'll notice once again on May 26th, 2021. And the color indicates the timing. So the black outline here indicates that will be at night. You can see the time is 8:34 p.m. And we have above that orange, that indicates golden hour. And so we can see the timing of these various events. Now, of course, keep in mind that we have here, for example, a full moon. It might be blue. No, it doesn't look like it. No, because we had the 27th. A blue moon being a second full moon in a single calendar month. But we have the blue here, which indicates blue hour. So a full moon during blue hour, but even during sunset or after blue hour, there could still be some very nice photos there. So don't take the times too literally, because we do have the opportunity to be able to, of course, adjust our timing for the specific photography and still have a great result. So I'm going to go back to our October 30th date here, and we can see once again, we've got the real full moon when it's at its absolute fullest is at 4:29 a.m., but we also get these details here so we know when the sun is going to rise, and so we have the sunrise time here. The moon will set after sunrise, and then the sun will set and the moon will rise a little bit after the sunset. And one of the things to keep in mind here, theoretically, you would get up at 4:29 a.m. and photograph the full moon when it's moderately high in the sky, all things considered, versus waiting for the moon to set. But you also want to take into account the lighting conditions. So when the full moon is at its fullest, in this case, at 4:29 a.m., it's going to be very dark. That would work fine for a photo of just the moon, but if you're going to incorporate the moon into an overall photo, a landscape as it were, then generally you want that moon lower in the sky and closer to sunrise or sunset. And so that'll help ensure that you don't have this tremendous contrast. And we'll talk more about exposure for the moon a little bit later on. And also notice that the moonrise and the moonset, when we're talking about a full moon, the moonrise and moonset are always going to be very close to sunrise or sunset. And that's because, by definition, a full moon, from the perspective of Earth, the moon appears full when it is opposite the sun. So think of it as the sun on one side of the Earth and the moon on the exact opposite side of the Earth. And because that's the case, we're going to see that the moon will rise or set at around about the same time that the sun will rise or set, because they are opposite each other relative to our perspective on Earth. All right. So then, of course, there are other considerations that we need to think about. So let's look at some of those considerations. I'll bring up our slide here, and this is an example that features obviously the full moon rising over the heart of Rome in Italy. And so this photo was captured actually while I was leading a photo workshop and in Rome, Italy. And so we planned ahead. Thankfully, the weather cooperated. But one of the other considerations, of course, is what focal length lens should you use? And that, of course, depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But as a general rule, the scene itself in some ways will dictate the lens. So if you're only photographing the moon, then you want a very long focal length lens. Maybe a 600 millimeter lens would be a good choice, for example, to have a photo that's just the moon. But if you want to incorporate the landscape, the scene in front of you, putting the moon into the frame as opposed to a photo of just the moon, then usually I recommend aiming for somewhere around a 300 millimeter lens. That introduces some challenges, to be sure, but if you want the moon to appear reasonably large in the frame, then you're going to need to use a relatively long focal length. And that, of course, means you're essentially zooming in on the moon, as it were, to make the moon larger in the frame with a longer focal length lens. And then in order to incorporate a meaningful scene in the foreground, you're going to likely need to back away from that scene. And so this particular example, it essentially looks, I would say, as a somewhat wide-angle photo. At least to me, it's showing a wide range of the heart of Rome, Italy, but this is actually with an effective focal length of 238 millimeters. So in the context of moon photography, it's not a very long focal length lens, but in the context of normal photography or, travel photography, that would certainly be a relatively long focal length. And so that means that generally you're going to want to try to plan, number one, for a relatively long focal length lens, something on the order of 300 millimeters or more. And that in turn also means that you're likely going to need to move a reasonable distance away from the scene. And so if you notice the building on the left side of the screen here, you might be familiar with that. That is a monument in Rome, Italy, the Altare della Patria, and that is approximately 1 mile from the position where I was standing when I captured this image. And so a fair distance away, because I'm using a relatively long focal length lens, so that I can have the moon be, in this case, not large in the frame, but just large enough to be sort of a key player or a noticeable subject, if you will. So then the question is, where should you photograph from? Here you can see that I like to think that I got a pretty good location from which to photograph Rome with the full moon rising in the background. So how do we plan for that particular position? And this was actually planned in advance. I knew exactly where the moon was going to rise. I say that. I was still very nervous because this was during a photo workshop that I was leading. So even though I had gone through all the steps of planning, as I'm going to show you here momentarily, where to be for that full moon rising, I was still nervous that I got something wrong and that the moon wasn't going to show up at all, or it was going to show up in the completely wrong location. So let's take a look at how we can actually determine the location. Now, first and foremost is to consider when the full moon is occurring, where will you be? you might be at home and you just want to get out somewhere nearby and capture a photo of the full moon with an interesting scene juxtaposed with it. Or maybe you know you're going to be traveling during a particular time of year in an interesting location, such as Rome, and you want to plan for the moon, whether it's a full moon or any phase of the moon that you'd like to photograph, a crescent moon over a key monument in Rome, for example. So where will you be? And kind of taking that a level deeper, what are some of the nice scenes available in that location? And so, for example, if I'm planning a full moon shot in Rome, it's very helpful if I'm already familiar with Rome, so I kind of have a sense of what sorts of subjects might be possibilities. So I'm thinking of, the Colosseum or St. Peter's Basilica or the Spanish Steps, the Pantheon, some of the common sort of tourist attractions or common monuments that you might visit and those sorts of things. So the better you know the area, the more you can plan in detail. So let's take a look once again at PhotoPills and take a look at specifically the planner that can help us tremendously in terms of figuring out where we want to be to capture our actual photo. So once again, I'm still in the moon option here, the moon pill for this PhotoPills app, and I'm going to go back. So up at the top left, you'll see that we have the back button. So I'll tap back to go back to our list of pills, and then I'm going to choose the planner. So up at the top left, we can see the planner pill there. And is the moonrise, see Stephanie's question here about the moonrise date. So is the moonrise date, that would be on the same date. So just switching back here to the rise and set. If we see on this date, so we're currently in the moon pill looking at a particular date. Now I've gone back to today's date, December 2nd here, but I can switch to any date that I'd like, and that will be the set for the moon and the rise for the moon on that specific date. And so you obviously would want to take that into account. And once again, bear in mind that we're not currently looking at the date for the full moon, but if it rises at 6 in the evening, it's going to set, overnight or what have you. There's always going to be other opportunities close by. So if this were the full moon, I could still take a look at the moonrise and the transit for the moon earlier, and I could take a look at the transit for the moon after it rose, before it set. And that gives me a little bit wider range so that we can deal with some of the other considerations we might have to contend with that moon photography, full moon photography. All right, and so then, once again, looking at the planner. So I'm going to tap planner, and we are already set to Rome, but I do need to, and actually I do have the date set, so I have the December 30th date set down at the bottom here in the planner. If I needed to change the location, so if I'm wanting to search for a particular location, then I can tap load down toward the bottom center, and that's where I can perform that same search that we saw earlier for a particular location. And if I need to change the date, then I can tap this timeline down here, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment, but I'll tap the timeline, and that brings up a search option. So currently, I'm looking at December 30th, 2020. Again, this is the date of the full moon in Italy. In North America, that would be December the 29th. And I'm set to a particular time. We won't worry about the specific hour because we'll fine-tune this as needed. So I'll go ahead and tap done there at the top right. And now we can consider what we're going to come up with in terms of a location for our full moon. And so again, if we had not already set our location, I could tap that load button down at the bottom. I can also navigate directly on the map, as we'll see here shortly. And then I could set the date by tapping on the timeline down below and setting a particular date. So we're currently looking at the next full moon in Rome, Italy on December 30th, which will be December 29th for North America. And you'll see that on the map, I have a red pushpin. I often refer to it as the orange pushpin because it looks a little more orange to me than red. But we have that red/orange pushpin that designates what is presumed to be my location. In other words, the position from which I think I'm going to photograph the full moon. This could also be used to plan for sunrise and sunset, etc. And we'll see the details of the moonrise and the moon set. And so we can see that on the timeline, in fact, down at the bottom center, there is an indication of the sun. Notice the yellow arc, the sun rising and setting, and then the moon setting and rising. And so we can see the specific times for those different events. But we can also scroll through time, and this is, I think, especially helpful. And so we have lines that indicate the moon setting and the moon rising. And so, for example, transitioning through this date, December 30th, at the moment, if you take a look down at the timeline at the bottom center, I happen to be set now to 12:54 p.m. So in the middle of the day, when we know that the moon is not actually visible. The moon has already set. And in fact, we get that visual indication on the timeline as well. So we can see the moon is below the horizon and the sun is above the horizon, and they'll sort of cross paths in terms of rising and setting. Obviously, at sunrise, the moon is setting, and at sunset, the moon is rising, more or less. Not precisely in terms of those timings, but approximately. And so we also know that the moon will be in a particular position. In other words, if I'm standing in the position identified by my red or orange pushpin here, what direction do I need to look at moonrise in order to see the moon? Where will the moon be on the horizon? Well, this light blue line points the direction that you would need to look in order to find the moon as it's rising. So I could get myself set up and know this is the position, this is the direction I need to be facing to see the moon when it rises. That also means, of course, that I can use those details to figure out whether or not I'm in a good position and to plot a position. In other words, if the moon's going to be over there, I want to be looking over here to see where I need to be positioned and put in between, essentially, an object that I would like to put in the foreground. So I'll zoom in just a little bit, and let's say we have the Altar de la Patria here, and if I wanted to have that in my shot at, let's say, moonrise, I'm going to tap and hold on the map to say that's the position I plan to stand. So I'm going to tap and hold until that red pushpin appears, and we'll see that at moonrise, the moon is going to appear in this direction. Of course, if I'm standing in this position and the moon is rising there, and then as the moon rises, it's going to arc across the sky in this direction, my view is going to be blocked by this rather large building. So I might need to find a different position, and in this case, it's not going to work out very well because by the time the moon was, for example, behind the Altar de la Patria, it's going to be so high in the sky that it's probably not going to make for a very nice photo. But then just to swipe through that range, let's go ahead and swipe across until we get to the moon rise. So let's pretend like we thought this would be a good location. As the moon rises, now we have a secondary moonrise line, if you will, that light blue color, and that indicates the azimuth, the direction to the moon at this particular time. So at the moment, we have, and in fact, I'm going to swipe across up above our map view display. We have a little toolbar there. We can actually swipe among the different pages so that we can see some of the different details. And I just want to remind myself of what time the moon was rising and setting. And so here we see the moon rises at 5:03 p.m. and at 5:55 p.m. the azimuth is in this direction. We still don't know if it's going to be high enough for me to actually be able to see yet. But as I drag across the timeline here, I can see where the moon, how the moon is transitioning across the sky, and at the moment focused primarily on azimuth, the direction. And so as we get closer now to the moon set, the dark blue line, you'll see the direction that I would need to look in order to see the moon as it's down low in the sky, as it is getting closer to the horizon. And so I'll want to take into account those times because chances are I'm not going to be photographing the moon at moonrise or at moonset. I need to instead take into account the fact that, of course, we need the moon to get up at least a little bit above the horizon so that it's in a more interesting position. And so let's take a look at just some various examples. In fact, we're pretty close to the Colosseum here, so let's slide down the street here to the Colosseum, and I'll press and hold to position my push pin here. I'm going to swipe across my timeline, to get back toward that moonrise time. And so we could take a look here for the moonrise. Notice that I can find a position here where I'll zoom in a little bit closer, where just after moonrise, we'll probably need to get the moon a little higher up in the sky, but I can see the angle to the moon, and as it's getting higher and higher in the sky, where it's more visible and it's above the buildings, etc., and I realize, I could get a shot of the Colosseum in the foreground with the full moon in the background. I can tap and hold to fine-tune my position a little bit so that, for example, I have that full moon maybe just to the left of the Colosseum, using a long lens to get just a segment of the Colosseum on one side of the frame and the moon on the other side of the frame adjacent to the Colosseum. Or, as we'll see momentarily, we could also try to look for further away distances in order to be able to use a longer lens and have a nice compressed scene. All right, so now let's get this a little bit more complicated. We're going to take a little bit closer detail. And, I see Linda's question. You can adjust the options in terms of kilometers versus miles in the settings. So if you swipe to My Stuff on that main page where you see the pills, and then you'll swipe from left to right, you'll get over to My Stuff, and there you'll find settings. And let's see here. Checking to see if there's any other questions here. Okay, looks like that's it for the moment here. And so let's take a look at a slightly more complicated scenario. I'm going to pan across and let's go find St. Peter's Basilica, for example. And for the moment, let's just assume that we want to be inside of the piazza there. And we can see that if I'm positioned down at that southern extreme of the piazza, then I've got the moon. The moon at moonset goes up there toward the top left. And so I know that I would need to look from this position, look in this direction at moonset. But chances are, I don't exactly want, as I mentioned before, I don't want to be working at moonset precisely. It's going to be a bit before moonset. So let's swipe back and let's see. So we're on December 30th here. I'm going to swipe back to the moon setting on December 30th, that full moon. And the reality is I probably want to be a little bit before the moon has actually set. I want to photograph. I need the moon to be reasonably high in the sky. Maybe here I'm hoping to juxtapose, for example, the full moon with the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Well, this is where I can take into account a feature called geodetics. And so once again, up at the top of the map here, that panel that's currently showing me sunrise, sunset, moonset, and moonrise, I can swipe, in this case, from left to right, all the way over to the left end, and that will give me my geodetics feature. And you can see a little icon on the left side of that panel that shows me an orange or red push pin and a black pin. I'm going to tap on that little button, and a black pin appears on my map. So I've positioned my red/orange pin where I think I need to be for my photo, but now I'm going to tap and hold on that black push pin, and by tapping and holding it will pop up, and then I can keep my finger on the screen and drag it into position right at the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. And now, up at the top, we can see that we have a distance and an altitude difference, but we can ignore that for the moment because we're actually seeing that the altitude for ground level, not for the basilica. We're not taking into account buildings here, unfortunately. But below that, we see that we have an indication of the moon height. The moon will be 372 feet above the position of my black pin. In other words, above ground level in this position. But is that enough to get above the basilica? Well, thankfully, Google can often help you, or Wikipedia can often help you to track down this information. As it turns out, the height of St. Peter's Basilica is 448 feet. And so from this particular position, that's actually not going to work. By the time the moon is in this position where I can, see it or have it positioned well, it is already getting too close to setting. It's too low in the sky. I could see maybe if I move my position out further out into at the entrance area of the piazza. Now at this time, and so if I get back into right about there for my position, you can see that the moon will be basically 1,000 feet up above that position, and that is well above. It's basically as high as the basilica is, the moon will be that much higher. So a reasonably good position. And of course, I could shimmy my position. If you think of the orange pin as me standing there with my camera, I could move a little over to the left so that I'm getting the moon into position, or I could wait for the moon to go just over to the right. So I'll adjust my time here and like there, for example. And now we see our information up above that the moon will be a relative height. So think of this as if the basilica is 448 feet tall and the moon is 762 feet above that position, it will appear from our vantage point to be 762 feet above the ground, or if someone wants to do the math, that's getting close to about 300, just shy of 300 feet above, which means, roughly 2/3 of the height of the basilica itself. It will be that much higher up in the sky. Notice to the right there of that moon height, relative to that black pin position on the map, that its size will be 13 feet. Well, we certainly know that the moon is not 13 feet in diameter. I don't know what the diameter is, actually. I just know it's a pretty big object. I'd have to look that one up if I were going to share that. But this means relative to the scene that you're photographing. And so if you were to go, in this case, out to St. Peter's Basilica, if somebody could put a little banner across the front of St. Peter's Basilica that was exactly 13 feet wide, that tells you how large the moon will appear in the frame. So whatever, in this case, that 13 feet represents in the context of the basilica, that's how big the moon will appear in your photo, in the sky. So it's a relative size based on the scene that you're photographing. But then we could also, of course, back away. So I mentioned ideally we want to use a long lens, and we want to therefore be further away. So if we can get as far away from our subject as possible. Just for reference, by the way, the position, so we can see, once again, the Altare della Patria, that's right here at the center of your view. And as I zoom out, I'm going to position so that the point where I photographed from is right on the left edge of the map at the moment. And so that gives you a sense of the distance. That's about 1 mile. And you can see now, comparing that to the distance between the black and the orange pins there, that's a relatively short distance. But what if, for example, I could actually photograph? So the Altare della Patria has a rooftop. It closes at sunset, so you'd have to take that into account. But you can go up to the rooftop there. So I'm going to press and hold on that rooftop, and we can then see, can we get a good photo potentially, still referencing the basilica. And so now you'll see that at that position, well, that particular time, let's go to a little bit later time as we cross the basilica. Now the moon's going to appear to be about a half a mile up in the sky. So that's not working very good in terms of our vantage point, juxtaposing the moon with St. Peter's Basilica, of course. But it also, because I've gone a greater distance away, the moon size is now increased to 76 feet. So again, if somebody took a tape measure across the front of St. Peter's Basilica and marked out 76 feet, and I'm looking from the rooftop of the Altare della Patria, that 76 feet represents how large the moon will appear in my frame. So if I zoom in on that scene, that moon's going to look relatively large in the frame. And so again, the idea is to try to make sure that we're finding a good vantage point, taking into account not just the angle to the moon, the azimuth, the direction that we need to look at moonrise or moonset, for example, but also taking into account the elevation, the height relative to the horizon. And so making a point, of course, of tabulating all of that, taking all of that into account. It can be a little complicated, and I would say certainly a little practice can help where you get more comfortable in anticipating, for example, anticipating as the moon gets closer to setting. Notice that when the moon is high in the sky, let's say it's going to be pointed to the south, but it's going to start at moon rise up to the northeast, and it's going to transition across the sky to the south, out to the west, and it's going to set out there in the northwest. So the moon is not only going up and then down as it rises and then sets, it's going in an arc. And so in this case, kind of this arc that goes all the way around from the northeast all the way around to the northwest. We obviously want to take that into account as well. And of course, there's more we have to take into account, so let's consider that as well. And that would be one of the key factors would be the weather. And when it comes to weather, I like to plan, but I also love luck. And so I try to plan as best I can so that I have a good sense of what's the best timing, what is the best option in terms of my whether I'm going to try to aim for the moonrise versus the moon set, for example, or going the day before versus day after, where the moon will still be pretty close to full. This, by the way, some of you may have seen this photo. This was during another photo workshop I was leading in New York City, and we had terrible thunderstorms. There was a little gap where we could photograph some of the scenes in Brooklyn here, and then very severe thunderstorms, so we got dinner during that time. And then once the storm had passed a bit, we went out and photographed the lower Manhattan skyline with the Brooklyn Bridge. And with my camera set to time-lapse with bracketed exposures, a lightning strike, and it just so happened to occur during one of those exposures. So I will absolutely take luck anytime I can when it comes to the weather or anything related to photography, but as much as possible. Now, the further out you're looking at the weather, the less accurate the forecast is going to be. And so you need to take it with a grain of salt. If it's 10 days out, there's a good chance that it's not very accurate. But let's at least take a look at some of the options in terms of looking at the weather. And so first and foremost, I use primarily for overall planning an app called WeatherBug. And so the WeatherBug app gives me I found a nice interface, and I've just found it's easy to navigate. So it's one that I like to use. And so we can set that to a location. So up at the top center, you can actually add additional locations. So here, for example, if we were looking at Rome, Italy, that we were just using for our planning example, then I could set that as my location. So we can set the particular location where we are or where we're going to be. And then I start off well in advance with the 10-day forecast. And so I'll tap 10-day there and trying to get a sense. If we're looking at Thursday and Friday, chance of rain showers looks like partly to mostly cloudy, but then we get some partly cloudy days, then a mostly sunny day. Now, the ideal, of course, is that the best weather day corresponds with the full moon day. But so part of this is anticipating in advance, and I usually monitor the weather a little bit as we're getting closer and closer to the full moon, for example, or the particular dates I'm going to be in a location, and try to get a rough idea and start planning, when might I visit particular scenes or subjects. And then, of course, when it comes to the full moon, I've only got ideally a one-day window, the day of the full moon. I can go a little bit earlier, the afternoon the day before, the morning the day after. So there's a few opportunities, and try to look at what's going to be my best option. So kind of big picture, which day looks to be best, closest to the actual full moon. And then as you get even closer, we have, of course, the hourly option where we can take a little bit closer look at what that weather is looking like. So for example, if the full moon, it's not going to be a full moon tonight, but if it were going to be a full moon tonight, we're in pretty good shape because right around sunset, it's expected to be clear, and it's supposed to remain clear until the early evening. And so that would potentially be a great opportunity. It can always change at the last minute. Forecasts are not always 100% accurate, but they give us a pretty good sense. And then as we're getting even closer, I would go to the now option. And so for the now option, we're able to take a look at, of course, the current conditions, but more importantly is the ability to see maps. And so I'll tap that, and we could zoom out. So let's go see where there's some actual weather over here. We've got these some rain, looks like maybe some thunderstorms there, and so we can get a sense of those. At the bottom left, there's a play button, so I can see how that, in this case, rain and a little bit of snow toward the top left, how that is progressing. And you'll notice the increments here. So as we're playing this back, we're getting 10-minute increments. You can see the play indication there at the bottom left with the time. We get 10-minute increments, and you can kind of project, you can extrapolate where that rain's going to be or when it's going to pass you. So if I'm concerned about, rain, snow, precipitation in general, that's one of the options that I'll use. At the bottom center is a layers button, and another very helpful option is to take a look at satellite. So if I tap layers, you'll see the various options, the radar for seeing precipitation, and then another option that's very helpful is satellite. So I'll tap satellite, and that gives me, I'll zoom out a little bit so we can see a broader area, and tap play. That gives us a visible satellite where I'm able to see the clouds and how they're transitioning. It can be a little deceptive, as I'm sure many of you know, storms can kind of pop up out of the blue, so there's no rain on the map, and all of a sudden rain shows up. Clouds dissipate and reform depending on atmospheric conditions, but this does give you a reasonably good sense of the trend information so that you can, hopefully figure out what's going to be an optimal time for your particular photo, for the opportunity that you're trying to take advantage of. And then another app that I also use when it comes to that element, I sort of cross-reference a lot of times between different apps to try to get a good sense of the overall weather and what my overall conditions might be, and especially as we're getting closer and closer, when is the rain likely to start, etc. And so that is an app called Dark Sky. Now, there's actually a couple of Dark Sky apps, and one of them is aimed at dark sky, at figuring out where you can go to have a very dark sky so that you can see more stars and meteor showers, etc. But there's also a dark sky weather app. So let's take a look at that briefly. And the idea here is it's giving you what hopefully is a pretty good preview of what the weather is going to be, what the weather's actually going to do. And so we'll see, for example, up at right about in the middle of the screen, the next hour, no precipitation. Doesn't necessarily mean no clouds, but, to get precipitation, you do need clouds. So the two do go in hand to some extent. And then sort of this hourly indicator. Now it's clear, and there will be no change until we see something else, which in this case would be mostly cloudy. So at some point, those clouds are going to move in or build up. And so that's another app that can be very helpful. And then also considering the overall exposure. And so sometimes it's very easy. So here, for example, the moon is setting just a bit after sunrise. So by the time the moon's setting, the sun's gotten up reasonably high. We have a pretty equal overall contrast, I would say, even overall exposure. So it works out pretty easily. Other times, of course, it can be a bit of a challenge. Here, it's actually easier than it looks. Contrast here is rather extreme. But what about the exposure? Well, let's consider what we're actually taking a picture of here. It's the moon. The sky is dark. It's black, essentially, because this is at nighttime with the moon high in the sky. But what if you were photographing on the surface of the moon? On the surface of the moon, it's a clear, sunny day. So think sunny 16, where you set your lens aperture to f16, and your shutter speed essentially, quote-unquote, equals your ISO setting. It's really the reciprocal. So with a 400 ISO, you would use a 1/400th of a second. That's sunny 16. Keep in mind the moonlight is reflected and it comes down through the atmosphere, and so we're losing some of that light. So normally, I call it full moon 11. So think sunny 16, but use aperture f11 and then shutter speed equals ISO. And again, it's reciprocal. So at 200 ISO, you'd want about a 200th of a second. But it depends on the conditions. So in this case, actually, I needed full moon 8. Essentially, I needed to use a lens aperture of f8 rather than f11, probably just because there's more haze in the atmosphere than I necessarily realized at that time. This photo from Rome, this was captured at f2.8, a 30th of a second, and 400 ISO. That's an exposure value of 6, which happens to correspond with a night scene. but that should represent a significant overexposure for the moon. So how did I get the moon to actually not be overexposed? Well, you could use HDR, but in this case, the haze with the moon very close to the horizon, the haze did the trick. It balanced out that exposure. And note, by the way, I generally recommend aiming for a minimum shutter speed of about 125th of a second to help make sure that the moon remains sharp and smart, so that because the moon is moving, all things considered, relatively quickly. And so then we'll turn our attention once again to the PhotoPills app. And so we'll close out of this and go into PhotoPills, where we can take a quick look at exposure. So I'm going to tap on that exposure pill, and you could dial in test settings and see what the other settings should be. But what I wanted to focus on here, down at the bottom left, you'll see our exposure values, and this can be helpful. So for example, if we are thinking about kind of a typical scene, typical scenarios, we have this list of exposure values, and so we can go find, for example, full moon, and this is outdoor natural light, but the full moon would be calling for an exposure value of 15. And we have moonlight, which would be a very dark scenario, a nighttime shot. So if we have the daylight, let's see if I have something that's reasonably close here. Night vehicle traffic or fairs and amusement parks would equate to, so if you consider that full moon rising over Rome, that is somewhere in that range of vehicle traffic at night or fairs and amusement parks. That would be a very similar exposure value. So that's a rather significant difference compared to an exposure value for a full moon of about 15. And you can actually do some calculations. So if we are in this exposure pill, I could say, okay, well, what does that translate into? If I set my lens aperture, for example, to f8, and if I use a 500th of a second shutter speed, when do I get to an exposure value of 15? And here we're going up to an 800th of a second, and you can continue fine-tuning, trying to figure out what sort of settings will equate. The challenge is there's tremendous variability when it comes to having the moon high in the sky versus close to the horizon, the amount of atmospheric haze that you're photographing, the actual atmospheric conditions in terms of humidity, dust in the sky, etc. There are a tremendous number of variables, and so it can be really challenging to just guess essentially at an exposure without a little bit of trial and error. What I will generally do is try to spot meter off of the moon itself, because usually that's going to be kind of my key critical exposure consideration. And then also another consideration, of course, would be depth of field. So do I have the moon in focus? And that comes down to essentially hyperfocal distance. So hyperfocal distance essentially is the closest distance that you can focus and still have infinity in focus. Keep in mind, even if the moon is in focus, it may appear soft because of haze in the atmosphere or a shutter speed that was a little too slow, so we've got some motion blur. All sorts of factors can affect the actual perceived sharpness of the moon. But in terms of having it in focus regarding depth of field, we can take a look at the hyperfocal distance, essentially, calculating depth of field. So coming back into PhotoPills, and we can take a look at depth of field. So we've got a DOF over on the left-hand side here. I'm going to tap that, and we can dial in our particular settings. So coming back to that Rome shot, I can see at the top center, on the right-hand side anyhow, but at the top here of the screen, I've dialed in the camera that I'm using, and that will take into account the focal length and, of course, that cropping factor for the sensor. And then I'll dial in the lens focal length. So that was actually on a crop sensor. It was actually 149 millimeters, as it turns out in this particular case. And so I'll set that as the focal length. That was, I think it was a 238 effective focal length, if you do the math there, compared to 35 millimeter. And I used a lens aperture. So at the top center there, I'll tap the lens aperture. That was set to 2.8. A very wide open lens aperture in this case. So I must have very, very narrow depth of field. But then that next option, the third option there, is the distance to my subject, which was approximately a mile, just a hair over a mile actually, but I'm going to dial in 5280, 5,280 feet or 1 mile, and tap done. And so now I'm able to take a look at my hyperfocal distance. And so the hyperfocal distance is just shy of 1,400 feet, but keep in mind I'm focusing at about a mile, the key subject that I was setting my focus on. And so I actually could have focused quite a bit closer and still had infinity as the far limit for my depth of field. And so even though I was far away using a relatively long lens, well, not even though I was far away, even though I was using a long lens that was essentially wide open on the lens aperture, because I was focusing at such a great distance, I was actually able to achieve depth of field that went all the way from my foreground subject all the way back to infinity, which would include, of course, the moon. And so if I were focusing beyond that hyperfocal distance, meaning in front of, so let's say my foreground subject, and I saw there was a question earlier, if the foreground subject were 50 feet away, for example, now what happens? Well, now you're very likely not going to be able to have the moon and the foreground subject in focus. In addition, because you're close, now in order to have that foreground subject appear all the way in the frame, you probably have to use a relatively wide-angle lens, and that means that more than likely you are going to have a moon that is very, very small within the frame. All right, so that is a lot of ground that we have covered today. And so let's just do a quick recap here. First and foremost, find out when a full moon occurs. And I'm using the full moon as an example in part because I noticed there's a full moon just before the year ends this year, and I thought that would be interesting. Plus, I thought we'd have a photo contest, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So finding out when a full moon is going to occur, whether it's just the next full moon or a full moon, hopefully during your visit to a particular location, and then plan for a great location using that planner, for example, in PhotoPills to figure out what will be a good position where you can juxtapose an interesting subject with that full moon. Maybe it's a rock formation or a pier at the beach or whatever the case might be. And then as the date draws near, track that weather, certainly contemplate your exposure settings, and most important of all is to have fun with that overall process. It can be a lot of fun to photograph the full moon, but of course, it can be a little challenging if you haven't done your planning. And of course, luck plays a role as well. And yes, a really good point, actually, Mark. Still need to remove filters from the lens to prevent reflections. Yes, indeed. So if you have, if you were wanting to stack filters, you've got UV filter on the front of the lens, whatever other filters you might have, be sure to remove those because those will bounce back the reflections of the moon. And that can create these little visual artifacts, these little bits of light, almost like a lens flare type of a scenario. Keith, thank you very much. Glad you enjoyed. Let's see. Are you going to place this webinar for sale? No. I'm going to make it free, but thank you, Alicia. I'm glad you enjoyed. We do have a course that covers PhotoPills in much greater detail, which I'll tell you all about here in just a moment. Wow, well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. Lots of nice, kind words. I certainly appreciate that very, very much. And and Mark suggesting a soundtrack. Bad Moon Rising should be the soundtrack for the presentation here today. There's a couple of options here in terms of resetting. And so, in fact, let's bring this down and bring up once again. If you bear with me just a moment, we'll bring PhotoPills back up. There we are. And at the top right, so the question was, how do we reset to the defaults here? So at the top right for settings, where we're able to choose a date and a position for both of those, we can tap, in the case of the position, we can turn on the auto update option in order to have the location update based on our current position. And for date, you can choose that auto detect for the time zone as well as turn on that current date and time, and that will set the current date and time. There's a couple of other ways. We can position on the map automatically if we're in the planner already. You can double tap the moon in order to have that be the set to the current date. So a few options, of course. I do want to mention, so we're having a photo contest, full moon. So if you've got a picture of the full moon, and the deadline is going to be in early January, so you can still photograph that December 29th/30th, depending on where you are on the planet, full moon. Hopefully the weather cooperates for all of you. And the winner will receive a Tamron 100 to 400 millimeter lens for Canon or Nikon. Do note, because it's Tamron USA that's sponsoring, the winner does need to reside in the United States. I know that's disappointing for those of you who are outside the United States, but I apologize that those are the terms. But you can follow this link to get details on that contest and to submit your photo. And good luck to all of you for that. In addition, if you were impressed, as I have been very impressed by the PhotoPills app, we have published a comprehensive course on PhotoPills. It has, I think it's like almost 5 hours, maybe a hair over 5 hours. I forget the total duration, but it is comprehensive. There's a lot of material there that covers the features I talked about today and so much more. You can get it for just $19. Normal price is $29. It's called Photo Planning with PhotoPills. If you point your web browser to timgrey.me/pills, you'll get those details with the discount included automatically. And we also have a couple of online workshops. This was actually our Black Friday sale, but I wanted to extend this just a little bit since we were having a presentation today. The January online workshops that I'm teaching are 50% off right now for Black Friday. And the two are Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom Classic. So if you've got a little bit of a mess in your catalog, this is the online workshop that can help, as well as Photoshop for Lightroom Classic users. And the idea, the key benefit of these online workshops, there's live sessions, very similar to what we experienced today, and you're able to get answers to any of your questions along the way. And so if you want to join me for one or both of those, the bundle of both online workshops can be found by following this link, timgrey.me/January 2021. But at the very bottom of that page, you'll find links to the individual workshops if you're only interested in one of the two. Yes, the presentation today is being recorded, and so that will be published, and I'll send a follow-up email. It'll be on the Tim Gray TV channel on YouTube. A good follow-up question, reference to the term exposure value. What does it mean and how to use it? Exposure value, or EV, that's actually what stops of light are based on. So if we say we need a +1 stop exposure compensation, that's +1 on the EV scale. There's actually a logarithmic formula that can tell you what the actual EV is. And so under normal circumstances, we don't necessarily need to know the EV number. It's just we need to increase our exposure by, 1 stop versus 2 stops, or whatever the case might be, apply exposure compensation. But that also can help us to figure out other possible exposure settings. So if you know, for example, looking at that table that I shared, that, during blue hour, the EV is, it's probably somewhere in the range of 10, I'm guessing, but that's just a guess. And then you can calculate exposure settings to figure out what would be a good number. So we don't usually think of the EV number itself. It's usually a relative term of plus or minus a certain amount of exposure, but it is based on that logarithmic formula. Not that I understand logarithmic mathematics, mind you. I just am familiar with the formula and how you can work it to your advantage. Mini double exposure for the moon can be very helpful. HDR or bracketing. One of the challenges of trying to do HDR or bracketing for any moon, it is surprising how quickly it really does move in the sky. I know when you sit there observing the moon with the naked eye, it just seems to be sitting in one place. If you set up your camera on a tripod and zero it in on the moon, especially with a long lens, you can sit and watch it actually move. And that can be a factor, of course, in bracketed exposures. So do certainly keep that in mind. All right, and yes, PhotoPills is a course that's already published in the GreyLearning library, and so you can follow the link here, timgrey.me/pills, to get all of the details with that. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much. And yes, well, thank you, Kay. Lots of great comments. It's so wonderful. Thank you all very much. I'm just checking to see if there's any other final questions here. And so there was a question there about some of the various, the white dots in the case of the planner. So there are a variety of options. So let's just go right back and bring up PhotoPills here one last time. Bear with me just a moment as I bring up the app. There we are. And so you'll recall when I was in the planner, I was referencing this top panel here for the various features. And so for the geodetics feature, that black pin that we were looking at, I tapped that button to enable. Many of the features that you can see on the map, the sort of extra indications, are enabled by that. So for example, tapping the icon here for sun and moon, I'm toggling between nothing versus having both the sun and the moon shown versus just the sun versus just the moon. Let's get back to both. And so we can go through these various options. We can see a visual indication of when it's golden hour versus blue hour, etc. And so if you swipe through those various options, then you'll be able to enable some of the different features depending on the settings. And it looks like, just want to make sure I didn't miss any questions here. David, great question. You do not need a cell signal. Obviously, the map would need to be pre-cached. So if you browse the map ahead of time, you'd be able to still see the map. So for example, while you're on Wi-Fi, browse the map, and then when you're out in the field, that'll work just fine. But most of the other info, so for example, the timing of the moon and all those sorts of details, that's just built into the app. All right, and the recording will be available in a few hours, by the way, for those asking, and I will send a follow-up email once that is done. All right, so it looks like, well, if there's any other questions that I missed, I will try to pull those and include them in an upcoming Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, since we have gone far over time today. But thank you again so much for joining me today. Thanks to Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning webinar series. I'm glad to see that so many of you found today's presentation helpful, maybe a little entertaining as well, and I'll hope to see you online again soon, either for one of my upcoming online workshops or, of course, for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thank you all so very much, and I'll hope to see you online again very soon.